A daughter-in-law who can't produce a son is useless. You're not even worth being a woman. My husband and in-laws said, forcing me to agree to a divorce. My newborn daughter was taken from me, and I had no choice but to comply with their demands. When I agreed to the divorce, my daughter and I were immediately thrown out of the house. Years later, my ex-husband appeared before me, who had barely survived. What? You're still alive? You must be groveling to your poor parents to let you stay, right? Pathetic. It seems that belittling me was all he could think about. After you, I remarried a daughter from a large farming family. My wife bore me a son who will inherit everything, securing our family's future. We are 100% the winners. Jealous? He boasted arrogantly, followed by a crude laugh. I asked him about which prominent farm he was talking about. Taking pride in being part of the winning team, he arrogantly shared the name and location of the large farm, thinking it would inspire me to try and climb up to his level. When I heard the name and location of this large farm, I remembered something. Ah. That farm. Didn't you know? The land of that farm is actually. As I revealed the truth, my ex-husband exploded, calling me a delusional attention seeker. A woman over 30 being pathetic, he screamed. Little did my ex-husband and former in-laws know. An unimaginable fate awaited them for treating me like garbage. I'm a married woman in my 30s. Born as the eldest of 3 sisters, I lived at home until high school graduation. I moved out to attend college, which was conveniently located for commuting. After college, I found a job and did not return home. In my mid-20s, I met my husband through a friend and decided to marry. I told my parents about the man I wanted to marry, and we met face to face. But my parents opposed the marriage. Likewise, my husband had issues with my parents. My husband believed that as long as the couples were satisfied, there was no problem with our marriage. So, I proceeded with the marriage without reconciling with my parents and sisters. And afterward, I lost contact with them. I'm glad I don't have to deal with your poor-looking parents and relatives. You must be happy to be able to get rid of your meddlesome parents, right? On the day I introduced my husband to my parents, my father suggested that a private room would be best. So he arranged for us to meet at a traditional restaurant. My mother cherished the bag given to her by my father, taking good care of it and always carrying it during important occasions. It seemed like a lucky charm for her. There was a face-to-face meeting with my fiancé, and my mother even had the bag repaired in advance. However, my husband whispered to me that the bag looked poor. That bag is ugly. Its design is outdated, and it reeks of the old era. I believe it shows more taste to cherish and care for beloved items rather than being swayed by fleeting trends. However, my husband thought it was more important to follow trends. Due to these issues, my husband was glad that our relationship with my parents and relatives ceased. He often expressed that early in our marriage, we began our married life with my husband moving into the apartment where I lived. However, within half a year, we were set to move in with his parents, and I complied without objection. My husband thought it was wise to save money since raising children is expensive. And I agreed because I thought I could manage to live with my in-laws as things were. My in-laws had a history of working in companies from my husband's grandfather's generation onwards. During a time when jobs were scarce due to the war, my husband's great-grandfather happened to be hired by a railway company. At that time, as the industry was growing, the salary was supposedly good, raised by such a predecessor. My husband's grandfather believed that being a civil servant was the most stable job, and chose that path. However, my father-in-law failed to become a civil servant, and instead worked for a private company. My husband also worked for a company, but for one of the lower-ranked small to medium-sized enterprises. Our household income was below the average in the U.S., and we were somewhat dependent on the income of my still-working father-in-law. Despite this, my in-laws strongly desired a male heir. A true daughter-in-law is one who bears a male heir to her new family. Only then will she be acknowledged as a daughter-in-law. Please ensure that your first grandchild is a boy. Thinking that it was outdated to not consider a girl as an heir. I felt strongly about this because I had sisters. The idea that men were superior and women were useless was detestable to me, knowing my mother-in-law's beliefs. Still, during the first year of marriage, we managed to get by without taking things too seriously. As I was still working, I thought it would be fine if I got pregnant by the time I was 30. However, my mother-in-law had different plans. How long do you plan to keep up this newlywed act? It's common sense to have children in your 20s. Who knows what disabilities a child born from an older mother might have? Because I didn't quit my job, my husband started to feel pressured to perform seriously. And my mother-in-law submitted my resignation before I knew it. Of course. I was shocked when my boss told me that my mother-in-law had come to submit my resignation letter. But my boss simply agreed, believing that for a woman, marrying and raising children was the ultimate happiness and duty. Women who focus solely on work without marrying lack charm. My boss often made such problematic statements. If I had continued to work under such a boss, he might have made sarcastic remarks like, when I was going to have children or to take maternity leave early. And how fortunate it was for women to be able to have a temporary job. Indeed, someone had already resigned due to such comments from my boss. I was honestly troubled, but to avoid conflict with my mother-in-law, I resigned from the company. Then, my mother-in-law forced me to measure my basal body temperature and try to conceive on my ovulation days. It didn't go as smoothly as my mother-in-law had planned. Are you guys doing your part? You're not using birth control pills, are you? She suspected that I was intentionally using contraception because I didn't want to get pregnant. I wanted children too. Just like my mother-in-law, it's not only about having a boy, but... Then, my father-in-law, who had been silent until now, suggested that the problem might lie with me. He had heard that the cause of not getting pregnant often falls on the woman, and urged me to get tested immediately. The results showed there was nothing wrong with my body. I wondered if the problem could be with my husband. But my father-in-law stubbornly defended him, claiming that a man could not possibly be at fault, and blamed me entirely with his outdated belief that men have upheld our nation. In our family lineage, the firstborn has always been a boy. All the brides who joined our family were capable. It's unfortunate that my son ended up with a mismatched bride. We visited a church known for blessing couples with children, performed rituals, and bought charms and amulets in desperation. But there was still no sign of pregnancy. Though my in-laws meant well, it only added pressure for me. I asked my husband to let nature take its course and give us more space, but he wouldn't listen. It's shameful not to have a child after 2 years of marriage, as if I were infertile. He lamented, and instead put more pressure on me to try harder. As there were no signs of pregnancy, our relationship began to sour. He started coming home late from work, and on weekends. He always returned after drinking, reducing the frequency of our attempts to conceive. Honestly, I was relieved. It was exhausting to be obligated to be intimate with my husband every weekend, and on my ovulation days. With my husband often coming home late, my in-laws had fewer opportunities to blame only me, which calmed my mind. Then one day, in a rare good mood, my husband initiated intimacy. It had been a while, and hoping it might improve our relationship, I reciprocated. Weeks later, feeling unwell, I visited a doctor and was diagnosed with a long-awaited pregnancy. I returned to my in-laws' house feeling lighter. It was a pregnancy just before the end of my 20s, after 4 years of marriage. My mother-in-law's attitude changed dramatically once the pregnancy was confirmed. She became unexpectedly kind to me, significantly reducing my household chores. It was a thoroughly pampered full 9 months. As we reached the time when the baby's sex could be determined, my in-laws didn't ask to check in advance, so I looked forward to the surprise at birth. They believed I would surely have a boy because they think that I have a hard-looking feature. However, at the birth, I was greeted by the healthy cries of a baby girl. My in-laws had opposed my husband being present at the birth, claiming that men should not attend, so he wasn't there. I would have preferred him by my side, but faced with opposition from my in-laws, he seemed relieved. The meticulous care from my mother-in-law during pregnancy may have helped, as I experienced fewer health issues than expected. As my belly grew, even walking became difficult, and shopping alone was tough. So I once asked my husband to drive me. However, he only drove and did not help carry or load the shopping bags into the car, acting as if his role ended after conception. I sensed that raising our child would involve significant struggles over a long period. That's how things stood, with my husband and in-laws anxiously waiting outside the delivery room. Not only was my delivery delayed, but it was also difficult and lonely. At times, I feared I might not hear my child's cries. So, when I did hear her healthy cries, I no longer cared about the sex. Thank you for being born healthy. That was all that mattered. Yet, when the nurse informed my exhausted in-laws, "She's born, a healthy baby girl," by my bedside, they lashed out. I didn't wish for a granddaughter. Girls just go off to other men, nothing but a drain on resources. What a useless bride. Do you want to end our family line? What do you have against our family? Do you want to tarnish me with the disgrace of ending the lineage? Their noisy complaints bombarded me at my bedside. Don't they understand that giving birth is a matter of life and death? Even if I wanted to respond, I was too exhausted to speak and could only endure in silence. All I wanted was to be allowed to rest. Yet, my father-in-law claimed that since I come from a lineage of only daughters, I am destined only to have daughters, and shouted that I shouldn't consider myself a daughter-in-law anymore. Work like a servant, you don't need maternity leave. He tried to pull me from the bed. A nurse, hearing the commotion, intervened as my father-in-law, with a parting shot, said today was the only day I'd get to rest before he hastily left the room. My mother-in-law and husband followed him out. It was impossible to leave the hospital the day after birth, but once discharged, I returned to find my belongings had been moved out of my room. My father-in-law declared that a servant's room was unnecessary, and I should just curl up in a corner. I rented a storage unit for my belongings temporarily, hoping that if I managed the household and childcare without fail, my in-laws might eventually understand. Being in a corner of the room didn't bother me, but it was difficult with a newborn daughter. I begged my in-laws to at least let her sleep inside the room. They agreed to rent the room to me by the hour. I had some money saved from my single years, so I decided to pay the room rent from that. However, they demanded extra fees, complaining about the noise of her crying or the nuisance of disposable diapers. My daughter often cried at the sound of my in-laws yelling, and she wouldn't stop easily. My in-laws grew even angrier, finding her crying and fussing in response to their voices unendearing. I gradually lost any sense of how to reconcile with them. With no one to consult and barely leaving the house due to housework and childcare, one day, my husband's affair came to light. Or rather, it was a trap set by my in-laws. Unusually, my mother-in-law had suggested that my daughter and I should go for a walk in the park. Had I been calm, I might have suspected something, but exhausted, I took her up on her offer and relaxed in the park. Then I received a message from my mother-in-law, saying something serious had happened to my husband and I needed to return home immediately. When I returned as instructed, I found my husband with an unknown woman and my in-laws, all enjoying expensive catering food and chatting away. Since you haven't been getting pregnant, I asked somebody to introduce a girl who seems like she could have children easily. My mother-in-law had been consulting with a friend about my difficulty in getting pregnant, from joking about how her friend's daughter would make a good bride. The conversation progressed, and my husband hit it off with her when they met. They intensified their efforts to drive me out by constantly criticizing my housework, pushing me to leave on my own. Just when they had almost succeeded, my pregnancy was discovered. However, they continued to let my husband see the other woman, thinking that if a boy was born, all would be well, but if not, they had a backup plan. The child I bore was a girl, deemed useless. Since I didn't produce a boy, I too was considered useless. And they concocted various schemes to make me leave. But instead of running away, I endured and persevered. So they resorted to forcing a divorce with his affair partner present. I want to divorce you. You being here upsets my parents. And it makes our home tense, right? While I was stunned by his selfish words, my father-in-law snatched my daughter from my arms. He threatened to throw her in the yard unless I signed the divorce papers. I screamed for him to stop. It was the loudest I had ever shouted in my life. I had no choice but to silently sign the divorce papers. My husband threw a bank envelope with a meager amount of severance money at my feet as if paying me off. My daughter's belongings were thrown outside in front of me. As I picked them up, my husband and in-laws sneered and laughed at me. I endured the humiliation and frustration. I bit my lips so hard that I could taste blood in my mouth. My husband's affair partner seemed unfazed by the situation, even appearing smug. With nowhere to go, I had no choice but to seek refuge with my estranged parents. I could have managed alone, but it was not feasible with a newborn daughter. I was nearly broke. They had been taking extra money from me under various pretexts. My husband refused to contribute financially to our daughter's expenses. He told me to figure it out myself if I wanted to raise her. I contacted my parents, hoping they would at least take in my daughter. They told me to stay put once they knew where I was. Soon after, my father drove to me with my mother in the passenger seat. I began to share what had happened since I got married while they listened silently in the car, with my daughter and me in the back seat. The last thing I mentioned was my regret for not having told them about my daughter's birth, and pleading for them to take her in, at least. Then my mother said, "It must have been tough. You did well." My father curtly said, "Come back home." When we returned home, my sisters were still there, and my old room was just as I had left it when I moved out after high school. My father told me I could use that room as I wished. From the well-maintained floors and shelves to the fluffy bedding smelling faintly of the sun, I could deeply feel my parents' love. My mother had kept everything ready for the past 12 years, ensuring I wouldn't be inconvenienced should I return. My usually reticent father showed his deep caring without many words. Reflecting back, my father had never opposed anything I decided, except he had clearly said, "That man is not right for you," about my marriage. I asked why he had opposed it. I thought maybe he had conducted a background check on my husband without my knowledge. But that wasn't it. My mother said she didn't like to speak ill of others, but if she had to say, it was because he only looked at the surface. I remembered how my ex-husband had fixated on my mother's bag during our first meeting. He judged that carrying a nice bag meant being wealthy, while using an old one meant being poor. I regretted not listening to my parents' reasons for opposing the marriage and cutting ties to marry him. I apologized for acting selfishly and causing trouble. 3 years have passed since I divorced and returned home. Even though my parents welcomed me back, I knew I couldn't rely on them forever as a mother. These 3 years have been the most intense and lived-in years of my life. Then, one day, I encountered my ex-husband at a local agricultural cooperative. He looked much different than I remembered. His skin was sunburnt, and his hands were rough and unkempt. My ex-husband used to value wearing nice things as a status symbol, and was always meticulous about his appearance, regardless of his character. Seeing him in ragged and dirty work clothes was quite shocking. My ex-husband explained he was helping out at the farm of his affair partner's family, as instructed by his mother. My current wife's family owns a large farm. She gave birth to a son as her first child, securing a successor, so our family's future is secure. I thought he was just bragging, but he continued to disparage me. You returned to your poor parents, right? Must be hard living with a divorced 30-year-old woman and 2 spinster sisters. He asked if I had to grovel to my poor parents and how that felt, among other rude remarks. It's fine to speak ill of me. It's not worth getting upset over such vile comments. However, I couldn't forgive him for speaking ill of my parents and sisters, who had reached out to help me in my time of need. I remembered something about the farm he mentioned. I asked my ex-husband, "Which farm is it?" He said it was the largest one in the area. In fact, my parents had been leasing land to others for profit for generations. Going back in my father's family tree, it appears a very important person once ruled this area. Yet, he lived humbly, without luxury, aligning himself with the villagers. This principle of modesty has been passed down through generations in my father's family. That's why our home is just an ordinary 2-story house found anywhere. Since returning home, I've been helping with my father's business while raising my daughter. I learned that the parents of my ex-husband's affair partner were involved in my father's business. I informed my ex-husband that his affair partner's parents were actually renting land from my parents. He angrily accused me of lying. He remarked on my mother's old-fashioned bag and outdated clothes from the greeting, suggesting a poor person who had nothing else to wear. She can't even afford a new outfit for her daughter's big day. What a bottom-tier poor family, he yelled, panicking. I didn't have time to make up lies to find my ex-husband, who may or may not have been at the agricultural cooperative. I explained that I was there because my family manages rental properties. Our family owns not just farmland but also apartments and buildings. The tenants include a branch of a company well known enough that people would recognize the name if mentioned. Anyone who has lived in this area for generations knows we are like real estate kings. Originally, my middle sister was set to take over the family home when my marriage progressed. But during the 4 years I was married, she found her own dreams. That's when I returned. Having always been interested in my father's work, I decided to take over for him. My middle sister, chasing her dreams, is now working hard, having moved out. While I explained this, my ex-husband kept denying everything, saying I was making it up, that I must be delusional. If you're going to go that far, how about this? I remarried a childhood friend. When I showed him my wedding ring, my ex-husband's face contorted. I don't mean to brag, but my current husband loves my stepdaughter as his own. The popularity of an apartment building on land my father let me manage as a trial skyrocketed after my husband and I added our ideas. It was a previously outdated building with many vacancies. But now it's popular with young couples and considered great for raising children. My ex-husband exclaimed he hadn't heard such a story and lunged at me. You tricked me. Acting all poor. No, you're the one who assumed I was poor. Let go. I tried to push him away, but he didn't give up and grabbed harder. He then pulled my hair, so someone noticed the commotion and went to call security. A few men tried to help me, but my ex-husband resisted by biting them. A burly security guard appeared, which slightly intimidated my ex-husband. Seizing the moment, he was swiftly subdued and dragged out. Later, I received a call from my ex-husband. Thinking it was an apology for his earlier rudeness, I answered the phone. But he was actually begging for money. According to him, his mother had fallen victim to a termite scam, losing a significant amount of money and struggling financially. They borrowed money using their home as collateral. But his father had retired early after passing on the family business to my ex-husband. Thinking a successor had been born. It seems he was scammed out of his retirement funds too. Unable to cover the expenses for 2 households on his salary alone and too proud to admit it. My ex-husband had embezzled company funds and got fired. Not only was he dismissed, but he was also demanded to repay the full amount he had misused. His affair partner's parents ended up covering for him. My ex-husband and his parents lost everything, and were now repaying their debt through labor at the affair partner's farm. Even though they were working, their wages were seized for debt repayment, leaving them physically and mentally shattered. He claimed it was a living hell being milked dry to the bone. My ex-husband begged me to ask my parents to pay off their remaining debts. Please, only you can save us from this misery. Which right does he have to say that? I clenched my hand tightly to contain my anger. The pain of my nails digging into my palm felt like it was keeping my rage in check. Even when I pleaded for help, you cared only about your own image and didn't assist. I see no value in helping people who judge others solely by their appearances. I firmly declined his request, seeing it as a good opportunity for them to understand what it feels like to be oppressed. I also told him never to contact me again. However, I doubted he would listen, so I blocked his number on my smartphone and home phone. Then I started being stalked around the agricultural cooperative. Security, recognizing my ex-husband, chased him away. But he vaguely remembered the location of my parents' house and had also ambushed me there. When my parents or husband were around, he hid, but when I was alone, he would show up, threatening to follow me until I gave him money. This was truly annoying and became a topic of gossip at the cooperative, eventually reaching my parents, to whom I confessed everything. My parents were furious, and my husband suggested filing a police report. However, I preferred to avoid police involvement, thinking it might adversely affect our business. I wanted to settle things as amicably as possible, without holding any grudges, even if the other party was at fault. Perhaps that's why I'm seen as submissive. But if I can resolve matters without conflict, I prefer it that way. My parents then complained to the parents of the woman who stole me from my ex-husband. They sternly told them that their son-in-law had been our daughter's ex-husband, stolen by their daughter, and was now harassing our daughter for money, creating a nuisance with his stalking. They were responsible for dealing with this, as the cooperative was also hearing bad rumors about it. The parents of the affair partner, upon learning the truth and unaware that I was the daughter of a landlord, apologized for their terrible mistake. Later, the affair partner's parents came to apologize to me in person with their daughter. She admitted she felt ashamed for siding with my ex-husband's mother after being misled by her, thinking I was such a terrible daughter-in-law that maybe I should be driven out. Since words can be manipulated, I asked her to strictly discipline my ex-husband and keep an eye on him if she truly felt sorry. I also requested that they not interact with me outside of work. For now, our relationship is just between the parents, but eventually, it will be up to our generation. I don't want a relationship of mere convenience with the affair partner. I wanted a clear division, strictly professional. After being severely scolded by her parents, my ex-husband had his room confiscated, similar to what he had done to me. He now lives cramped with his parents in a corner of a tool shed. Eventually, my ex-husband's mother was disowned by the farm's parents after they discovered she had secretly harvested and sold their produce at night. My ex-husband's mother blamed her friend from the farm for making her suffer from hunger and berated her. However, she did not want to write off the debt she had covered, so she decided to lend her out to another farm. This farm was run by an elderly couple locally known for being cranky. But even with their crankiness, they hated acts that strayed from moral decency. When this elderly couple learned of what my ex-husband's mother had done, they reportedly reprimanded her quite harshly. Thanks to that, I heard she has become as thin as a skeleton. At the cooperative, I often hear various rumors. But lately, there's been no word about my ex-husband's family. It seems the affair partner's parents renewed the lease on their land, so they're likely still farming. The absence of rumors about my ex-husband suggests they are keeping their promise to supervise him strictly. The following year after this ordeal, I became pregnant with my current husband. We had a boy, but whether my daughter or son takes over in the future doesn't matter to me. I vowed not to raise them with the expectation that only a son can inherit. My husband treats both our daughter and son with equal love. Recently, my daughter seems to have grown a bit cheeky, enjoying her role as a big sister. With the support of my parents, our son is growing up healthy and carefree. My middle sister is still pursuing her dreams and rarely visits home. My youngest sister has recently met someone nice and has started talking about marriage. My parents are still far from retiring and continue to work hard. We all live fully in the present moment. Whether happiness continues is up to our efforts. I want to live without forgetting this sentiment.